across the globe by millions.
Alex Newman, investigative journalist and host of the Sentinel Report. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Kerry.
You've been doing some really very important work investigating what Agenda 2030 means. What have you found that we need to be concerned about? And when I say we, I mean people in Europe and the US, Canada, the West, and anywhere else.
Well, that's a big question, but I'll start by saying, yes, I've been investigating the United Nations and all of its different schemes for my entire career in journalism, going on almost 20 years now. And unlike a lot of people who investigate these organizations and things, I actually go there. I don't just read their documents, although that's important. I go and I talk to them. So I just got back a few weeks ago from Brazil. I was at their annual climate summit. And the year before that, I was at the UN General Assembly for the Summit of the Future. And so I like to go there and see what's going on and talk to these people myself. But when it comes to the 2030 agenda, you really don't have to do a lot of investigating to figure out what's going on here. You just have to read the document. It's not that long. There are some things that sound nice to the uninformed person who maybe hasn't thought through things, like, oh, we're going to end world hunger and we're going to fight poverty. And they, oh, that sounds wonderful. But when you stop and think about it just for one moment, you realize that's literally the exact same thing that every mass murdering dictator said before he started slaughtering people and putting them in camps. And as you keep reading this document, you realize that it is essentially a blank check on our liberties, our bank accounts, and our futures for the United Nations, which is completely unacceptable. I mean, you wouldn't trust politicians with a blank check on any of those things. Why would you trust unelected dictators and bureaucrats at the UN? So it's a very troubling document. To try to put it into context for people, the UN has a plan for the world. They have had for a long time. Back in 1992, they approved what they call Agenda 21. Now, this was a little bit different than the 2030 agenda. It's the plan for what they say is the 21st century, so it's the 100-year plan. And if you read it, it is essentially about empowering the United Nations, undermining national sovereignty, radically expanding the size and the scope of government in the lives of people, and really turning government into the primary institution that oversees all of our lives. So Agenda 2030 is a little bit different in that it's narrower in scope. It covers a smaller time period. It goes from 2015 to 2030. It replaces the Millennium Development Goals that were from 2000 to 2015. But the agenda is broadly similar. It's just, the Soviets used to have the 5-year plans and the 10-year plans and the 20-year plans. I think that's the best way to understand what the UN is doing here. They're coming up with concrete plans for specific time periods where they've got measurable objectives, defined goals. And again, I encourage people to read the 2030 agenda. When you read it, you'll realize that it's really a recipe for a global totalitarian political and economic system. It talks about redistributing wealth, not just within countries, but among countries. So we're talking about a global wealth redistribution, which of course will require a global coercive apparatus. It talks about defining your health care. It talks about mental health for all, abortions for all, vaccines for all. It talks about micromanaging agriculture. Really putting government in places where it doesn't belong on an industrial scale. Talks about indoctrinating our children to believe in these, what I would consider to be subversive ideologies, sustainable development, human rights, and by human rights, when I call it a subversive ideology, I don't mean in the sense that humans have rights. I mean in the sense that the UN defines it, which is you have no rights except what the government gives you. Gender equality, which sounds nice to the uninformed person, but of course doesn't really mean what people think it means, and on down the list. Global citizenship, which does mean what it sounds like, right? You'll be a citizen of a global system. So that's kind of the 50,000-foot view of what they're doing. They're putting on paper a plan to take control not just of your life, but also of your country and your children.
And so that's great that you're actually going to these places and interviewing people rather than just researching online. So that means that you will have looked into Agenda 2020 as well, 2021. And how has that, is all, everything in there actually come true so far?
Well, they've still got a long way for Agenda 21. Obviously, Agenda 21 is the agenda for the 21st century, so we've still got about, 74 years or so to go. But they're making a lot of progress, right? And you need to understand the ideology of sustainable development to understand what all this means. And the same is true with the 2030 Agenda. The 2030 Agenda is the name they give to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So if you look at Agenda 21, which is the program to make humanity and the planet sustainable, they're very, very clear about what this means, right? It means government control over everything from education to healthcare to land use to agriculture to media to, and they say this openly, right? This isn't like a top secret thing where you have to break into the smoky rooms. All you got to do is read the policy documents. I really think as a Christian, the best way to think of it is just take everything that God commands, all of God's moral instructions, how should humans relate to one another, and flip it on its head, right? God says thou shalt not steal. Well, the UN Sustainable Development crowd believes that property and wealth are inequitably distributed, and therefore we need to steal everything from everyone and redistribute it according to the whims of the bureaucracy and the technocrats. That is very, very troubling to me. I actually have, maybe I don't have it within reaching distance here, but I have the Agenda 21 for Children book. They make very clear that, and they got a big picture in there where these Hindu deities, I think they are very upset about all these babies being delivered by storks. And on the adjacent page, it tells you the problem. It says the earth groans every time it registers another birth, right? Well, you go back to your Bible, the very first command God gave to mankind was to be fruitful and multiply, right? Have babies, fill the earth. So everything that is good, true, and righteous is being suppressed, is being attacked by the UN, and they're making a lot of progress. Is it as fast as they would like? Probably not. They themselves talk about we have to break the old cultures, we have to break the old habits, very much like Mao's Red Guards used to say during the Communist Revolution in China. You got to break the olds so that you can bring in the news. You got to destroy the old so you can build back better, to borrow from the modern lexicon of people like Joe Biden. But it is a plan to completely overturn societal norms, basic morality, and ultimately to build a totalitarian one-world political, economic, and actually a religious system. And they're making progress very, very rapidly on that. You wouldn't know it from reading the fake media, but if you look at what governments are agreeing to, I mentioned that I was at the Summit for the Future at the end of 2024. They passed a document that almost nobody talked about called the Pact for the Future. And if you read it, it is very, very clearly a roadmap to empowering the UN to become a totalitarian global government. And again, people can just read it. You can see what it says for yourself. This was approved by every government in the world. Granted, Trump wasn't in office then. Trump has really been pushing back on this. So now they've got a little bit of a problem. Just within the last few days, Trump has announced that we're leaving 66 additional UN and international organizations, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is a big part of this fraud, the IPCC, the pseudoscientific climate science body of the UN, UN Women, the UN Population Fund, which is in charge of reducing the population. So they're facing a lot of pushback now, a lot of resistance. The Trump administration has specifically said multiple times on the floor of the UN General Assembly that we will not participate in the 2030 agenda. We reject it. It's a threat to our rights. It's a threat to our sovereignty. So they're facing more pushback right now than they ever have before, but they're still marching on, and people can read their own documents to see more.
So obviously Trump would have been specifically put up as president by the deep state, so they would have thought he's going to be in on bringing this forward. So what is actually happening there with Trump? Is he the good guy for America?
Well, if he's the good guy, that's between him and God. But has he resisted the globalist agenda? Unquestionably. I mean, there's no doubt that he has not only publicly rejected it in his words, but he has taken very, very dramatic actions to rein in and slow down and in some cases even reverse the advances that the globalists have made over the last few decades. I mentioned the executive order from just last week where we announced that we're withdrawing from 66 organizations. And by the way, they said that's just the start. There's a lot more organizations. This is just the first round. And I'll remind people that in the year running up to that executive order, we withdrew from a lot of the most important UN organizations and entities that exist. He announced that we're withdrawing from UNESCO. This is the UN Education, Science, and Culture Organization that is actually, I believe, the key UN agency to bringing about these goals. Because as they say in Agenda 21, as they say in the 2030 Agenda, brainwashing the children, educating the children to have the right values is the key to making this happen. So that is a devastating blow to their agenda, removing us from the World Homicide Organization, the World Health Organization, right? This is where the public health tyranny came down on the world during and after even COVID. Withdrawing from a whole bunch of the UN Human Rights Council, which is the dictators club that is trying to normalize and legitimize this very perverse, ridiculous understanding of human rights that is entirely at odds with the American understanding as enshrined in our Declaration of Independence that God gave us rights, that they are unalienable, and that since government didn't give them to us, the government cannot take them away. So Trump has absolutely been a major obstacle to this agenda. Have I agreed with everything he's said and done? Of course not. I don't think anybody has. But has he proven by his actions that he is not on board with this global agenda? I think he has. There are people who I respect who disagree with my assessment. They think he's, secretly working for the deep state, secretly bringing it in. But my best assessment, based on everything that we've seen throughout his term, is that he is basically a human wrecking ball when it comes to the architecture of global governance. And that doesn't mean the globalists are just going to roll over and play dead. They will try, as they always do, to make lemonade out of the lemons that they've been handed. And they may succeed. I don't know. I think they're going to try to crash the economy down on his head. I think they're going to try to stir up a civil war in this country. So I don't think they're all out of tricks yet. But I certainly believe that Trump has come to this from the perspective of truly loving his country, truly wanting to do right by his country, and truly standing in the way as an obstacle to this one world system that they're trying to build.
So it's not just talk then, it's actually put actions in place. That's
absolutely. Absolutely. And that is beyond dispute. Now, one thing that you could say is, well, he did some of this in the first term, and then Joe Biden came along and just reversed it all, right? Day one, which is actually what happened. And that's very unfortunate. We got out of UNESCO during the first term. Joe Biden got us right back in. We got out of the Paris Agreement. Joe Biden got us right back in. We got out of the WHO. Joe Biden got us right back in. But this time he is acting more strategically, right? And I'll give you an example because I've followed the climate shenanigans so closely because it is actually the key pretext on which they're building so much of this. The first time around, he got us out of the Paris Agreement and he stopped some of the funding for the UN climate fraud. And he continued to send people to the annual climate summits, and some of it was funny. He sent a delegation to the meeting. I think we were in Poland. It might have been Madrid. And they had a delegation that did a side event on how wonderful coal and oil have been for humanity, right? How they liberated us from backbreaking labor and expanded human lifespans and radically increased the prosperity of the world. And, oh boy, you could have seen the smoke coming out of the ears of the global climate mafia. But, Joe Biden came back in and literally day one, we're coming back to Paris, we're restoring all the funding, we're rejoining all this stuff. This time around, I mentioned the recent executive order. He announced that we are leaving the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, this is the 1992 treaty that actually underpins the entire UN climate regime, as they like to call it. The Paris Agreement is literally like an addendum to the 1992 treaty that was negotiated in Rio that was ratified by the Senate. And even the climate alarmist legal experts are saying, first of all, yes, he has the authority to do this. Second of all, if the next president wants to get us back in, they're going to have to get a vote from the U.S. Senate, 2/3 of the U.S. Senate, to ratify that. And the chances of that happening are virtually zero at the moment with the present political situation. Most Americans don't believe the climate hoax. Most Americans don't believe that their CO2 emissions are causing dangerous climate change. And even those who do, which is a minority, only about 1/3 of them are willing to pay one single extra dollar on their monthly electric bill to deal with climate change. So they're in big trouble now. This is not going to be, Trump leaves office and the next Democrat just comes in and rejoins all of this like nothing ever happened. Some of these changes that are being made are going to be long-lasting. They're going to be very difficult to reverse, and at the very least, it will buy the United States some more time so we can wake up more Americans.
Do you think that America will vote for maybe J.D. Vance next time and Republicans will stay in, or do you think Democrats might get in next time?
Honestly, I think a lot's going to depend on the voter fraud. Trump knows about the voter fraud. I know he knows about the voter fraud. I believe he won the 2020 election by a large margin. There's no way Joe Biden got 81 million votes. I mean, that's utterly preposterous. Nobody's ever gotten that many votes in human history. The guy didn't even come out of his basement. It's preposterous to believe that Joe Biden, maybe the most uninspiring candidate to ever run, with the possible exception of Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton, got more votes than even Barack Hussein Obama, right? I mean, come on. How dumb do people think we are? So if he can get the voter fraud under control, and I think there's a good chance he does, I think there's a very good chance that Republicans will hold power indefinitely. I think what we would see is a lot of states that people assumed were Democrat states will actually become Republican states. But that's a big if, right? Our Constitution puts most authority over elections with the state. A lot of our states are entirely captured by enemies of our constitutional system, enemies of the principles that our country was founded on. And I don't think they're just going to roll over and say, oh, yeah, sure, have honest elections and show that we've all been committing fraud and that we're all criminals. And right, so it's going to be a tough battle. If we can have honest elections, I think Republicans will maintain control for a long time. If we cannot have honest elections, I think there's a good chance that Trump loses the Congress in 2026 and that Democrats retake the House, impeach him, and all the rest of that even before the next presidential election. So we've got a lot riding on whether we can secure our elections. Trump has taken some initial actions on this, and in fact, people don't see the connection for the most part yet, but I think taking out Maduro was a big part of this. The election fraud actually runs right through Caracas, maybe a subject for another day. But he does seem to be taking this seriously. A lot of his allies are taking it seriously. And so I think if we have honest elections, there's a good chance that Vance or somebody else, it could be my governor, Ron DeSantis, it could be somebody that we don't know of yet, could end up taking the White House again. Might even be one of his sons, right? You see a lot of Trump 2028 shirts and signs and hats, so we'll see what happens.
Most of you watching these videos aren't yet subscribed, but it really helps the channel to grow. So do me a favor. It's free of charge. Hit that subscribe button now. I mean, talking about Venezuela, I thought that was to get the oil and because they're not part of the WEF and then because, the central banking system, and then also to get in more of a Zionist president or prime minister.
I've heard that. I disagree with the assessment. I grew up in Latin America. It's near and dear to my heart. I spent almost my entire childhood in Latin America, so it's a region that I care deeply about. I still have a lot of friends all over the region. And I've also, my entire career in journalism, tracked a subversive communist network known as the Sao Paulo Forum, created by Fidel Castro, the mass-murdering communist dictator of Cuba, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, who's currently the illegitimate president of Brazil, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, mass-murdering communists, and, of course, the FARC, the armed revolutionary forces of Colombia, who've been committing terrorism and mass slaughter of civilians for the last 50 years. Nasty group of people. And Maduro was basically the cash cow for this entire network of subversion. They're backed by the Communist Chinese, they're backed by the Russians, and more importantly, they're backed by the deep state in the United States of America. If you look at who has been aiding and abetting this communist terror network across the entire Western Hemisphere, yes, it's the Kremlin. Yes, it's Beijing. But even more importantly, it's the elites in the United States. It's the Rockefeller dynasty. It's the groups like the Council on Foreign Relations, the sister organization of the Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs in the UK. These are the people who dictate our foreign policy. In fact, the Council on Foreign Relations chief Latin American figure, for many years, by the way, only stepped down in the last few years, was a lady called Julia Swig, who's a Castro apologist, right? And thanked publicly a bunch of communist terrorists in her books. Why would the CFR, the epitome of the establishment in the United States, put somebody like that in charge of their Latin America programs? Well, it's because this is part of the plan, right? The globalists wanted to use the United States of America to rearrange the world order and then collapse the United States of America so that they could finish off the construction of this project. And I think Maduro was actually a key operative in all of that. The idea that his central bank was somehow independent, the idea that the Zionists did it. I don't even believe in the big Zionist conspiracy. I know a lot of people talk about that. I think there are people who call themselves Zionists who are motivated by legitimate religious ideals. There are people who call themselves Zionists who are very dangerous. Just like there are people who call themselves evangelical Christians who are motivated by subversive ideals and are not true Christians. And then there are, of course, the people who genuinely believe and love the Bible as the Word of God. So, I think you have a deep state in Israel, just like you have a deep state in the United States. And, the regime has actually not been removed. The regime continues. Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, has now been made the interim president. And she may have been more influential in the regime than Maduro himself, right? So not much has changed yet, except for the sending of a very powerful warning. And my take on what happened in Venezuela is that this is actually a very significant blow to the plot to take down the United States. And I'll go back in time a little bit for people to have some context here. Back in the 1960s and 70s, we had a organization in the United States called the Weather Underground. They bombed the Capitol, they bombed the Pentagon, they bombed the State Department, they murdered police officers and then bombed the funerals of these police officers, they robbed money trucks, and we found out that they were working very closely with the DGI, the General Directorate of Intelligence for the mass murdering Cuban regime. They were literally working hand in glove. And then we found out from the FBI operative who infiltrated the leadership of this network that their plan was to kick off a revolution in the United States, invite hostile communist foreign powers to occupy various parts of the country. The Cubans would get the southeast, Russians would get parts of the east coast, the Chi-Coms, the Chinese communists would get the west coast, Vietnam, North Korea, Central American communist governments all could play a part. And they were going to open up a network of concentration camps across the United States for people like me, people who were counter-revolutionaries, people who clung to the old system. And the guy who infiltrated the leadership of this terrorist organization, his name was Larry Grathwohl, he said that they intended to execute, liquidate, exterminate 25 million Americans as part of this, the Americans who could not be re-educated successfully. That was about 10% of the population at the time. Now, they failed in their goals, right? Bill Ayers ended up arrested. Bill Ayers was the founder of this terrorist movement. He got off on a technicality, but he went into education. He understood that we've got to brainwash another generation or two of Americans to get on board with this, and we've got to capture business. Well, today, they have accomplished that. And another couple of quick pieces of the puzzle for people to understand where I'm coming from. Yes, the Weather Underground was working with the Communist Cubans. The Communist Cuban regime was essentially a front group for the Soviet Union. It was a puppet of the Soviet Union, very much like Maduro was a puppet of Havana. And you can't understand geopolitics of the last century without understanding that the Soviet Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, was a globalist deep state plot from the very beginning. There's a masterful book about this written by Stanford historian Anthony Sutton called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, where he shows that Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky and the whole cabal of vile revolutionaries who overthrew and then enslaved Russia were being funded by the Wall Street megabanks. And the documents are all in there, corporate documents, State Department documents. So I don't think you can properly understand communism without understanding that it's not actually an ideology, it's not actually a movement, it's not actually an economic system. It's a smokescreen, it's a cover invented by megalomaniacs to cover for their criminal conspiracy and to enlist useful idiots in what they were planning to do. It's always been a movement that's been funded by the most wealthy people in the world, and it's always been a satanic movement to destroy human freedom and ultimately enslave humanity. So from that perspective, I think Maduro was a critical part of this, and taking him out, I think, is going to throw a major monkey wrench in their plans.
Interesting. I do agree with you that the term Zionism seems to have so many definitions to it. It is very confusing, and people, for that reason, they don't quite know what they're signed up to because it's so difficult. Unlike, this is a pen. Zionism, very hard to define for everybody's got a different definition of it. Yep. So let's talk about what's the most concerning thing in the next 2 years about the plan, both in the US and in the UK and Europe as a whole. Particularly, I would say Sweden, Germany, France and the UK and Ireland. But of course, Canada and Australia as well are feeling the pinch of this badly. Yep. So what's the most concerning thing for the next 2 years in those different regions?
Well, I think the ultimate plan is to collapse the entire Western world, what we used to call Christendom, what we used to call the free world during the Cold War. The plan is to collapse these societies, not for the sake of just collapsing the societies, but because the principles that they are founded on, and even today still tenuously cling to, are fundamentally incompatible with the vision of world order that they have. And by that, I'm referring to, of course, the biblical principles that our societies were founded on, right? Britain, for all its faults, to this day remains officially a Christian nation, right? It has an established Christian church. We could debate the wisdom of an established church, but Britain is an officially Christian nation. Now, it's true, most Brits don't identify as Christian anymore, and I think that's terribly sad. But if you look at the legacy of Britain, going all the way back to King Alfred and even before, it's entirely based on the Word of God. It's entirely based on the Bible. The Magna Carta came about when the army of God, citing the Bible, said, hey, wait a minute, king, you're not the law. You have to obey the law. God's law is superior to you and your things, and so you're going to have to respect our rights that God gave us, and we're not going to just do whatever you say. And so these principles are not compatible with the diabolical world system that they want to build. And so that's why the Western world, and really the Anglosphere primarily, must be utterly destroyed and annihilated. So I think the evildoers are hoping to collapse the United States, collapse the United Kingdom, collapse Australia, collapse New Zealand as functioning societies. And I think the mass immigration is a big part of that. I think the efforts to stir up a civil war are a big part of that. The indoctrination of the younger generations that we've seen now going back 100 years, very, very important part of that. And whether they'll succeed or not is a whole other question. We could talk about whether they will or not. But their plan is to collapse our societies. And I think what we will see, if this plan is not stopped, maybe even in the not-too-distant future, is actual, serious, high levels of violence breaking out, a fracturing of social cohesion, and what I think could fairly be described as a civil war. I think there's a deliberate agenda to get Americans and Brits to start shooting at each other, to start killing each other. They're obviously trying to destroy the food supply, and I think they want to collapse the economy all around us for the purpose of discrediting the economic system and ultimately for the purpose of discrediting the ideas that these societies were based on. So, I think they're going to try to do that probably sooner rather than later in the United States, because if Donald Trump and the people in his administration, for all their faults, can succeed in what they're trying to do, it will be exceedingly difficult for them to recover in the near term. So I think there's a very real risk that we see what the World Economic Forum described as a poly-crisis hitting the United States and the Western world very hard. And yeah, it'll hit the third world as well, but really the targets of this are the Western world. And I wrote 2 chapters in my recent book about the deep state on the subject of mass migration, because I think that's a critical part of the plan. First of all, we need to be clear here. They're the ones who have caused this mass migration, right? If you look at who blew up Libya, who blew up Afghanistan, who blew up Iraq, who blew up Syria. Yes, jihadists were often the tool, but who was it that helped them do it? Who was it that destabilized these nations and bombed them and bombed their critical infrastructure and stirred up a civil war and backed various factions at the same time in these civil wars? It was NATO. It was the UK government. It was the French government. It was the American government. And then they said, oh, wow, your country's destroyed. That's really terrible. Why don't you come to Germany? Why don't you come to the UK? We'll fly airplanes down to get you, and you can have free food and free apartment, and your kids can get a free education. It's going to be wonderful. Just come on up, and you'll be welcomed with open arms, right? Sweden, of course, was the recipient of millions of migrants over the last few years. This was designed for 2 primary purposes. One, destroy the nation state, right? What has happened in Western Europe and what will happen in the United States if they're able to open up the borders again and flood this country with migration from all over the world is a destruction of even the concept of nation states. And it goes partly back to the Bible. It was God's idea to divide people up into nations. He says it in Deuteronomy 32 and Acts 17. So the globalists want to destroy that and build a one-world system. But as long as you have people with an allegiance to their country, an allegiance to their family, that's a big obstacle. And so what they do is they flood these countries with enormous numbers of migrants. And you wake up one day and you're completely surrounded by people who don't share any of your history, don't share your culture, don't share your values. They don't even speak the same language as you, right? You say, well, what does it mean, these lines on the map? Why are we a country called Sweden? We don't have anything in common with each other, right? We literally don't even speak the same language. So, what do we need a nation for? What do we need a national state for? Let's just dissolve that and we'll be Europeans. And so you get the European Union kind of taking the place of government that the nation state used to hold. And then eventually you merge all these regions into the one world superstate that they're trying to build. The other agenda, and I dedicate a whole chapter to this, is the destruction of Christianity. And in Europe, that's been largely successful. I mean, yes, the church we know will never be defeated. The gates of hell will never prevail against the church. There will always be a remnant of Christians. But we see the church in Western Europe has been utterly decimated, right? These beautiful buildings that our ancestors built 1,000 years ago are sitting empty. They're being turned into mosques. They're being turned into discotheques or apartments. It's terribly sad. And I think that's one of the reasons they're flooding, particularly the West, with immigrants, is because they know that this will help destroy the last vestiges of Christian culture. Even in the West today, the very secular, people still teach their children Christian values. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, right? The Ten Commandments are foundational to our way of thinking, even among the secular population. And all that's got to be destroyed, right? So now in Germany, we don't have Christmas markets anymore. We have winter markets so that we don't upset the new arrivals. In Sweden, the lesbian bishop of the Church of Sweden publicly came out and said, hey, we ought to take the crosses down off our churches so that we don't offend the new Swedes. We ought to build prayer rooms to this deity Allah in our churches so that the new Swedes can go worship in these buildings that are empty anyways, right? So this, I think, is the twin purpose of the mass migration. And ultimately, it will fuel a civil conflict, I think, unlike anything we have seen, certainly in our lifetimes, maybe in a very long time. The Islamic invasions of Europe have been a regular fact of life for 1,400 years, so that's not new per se. What's new this time is that they were invited in by the European governments and given free money, and basically told, hey, the society you just came to is systematically racist, it should be burned down, we need socialism. We brainwash the kids to believe this nonsense. And so I think their plan is to ultimately collapse our societies. Whether they'll succeed or not, again, is a whole other question. I hope not. I will do everything in my power to prevent that from happening, but that's their goal.
It's the same people that opened the gates of Toledo in Spain. The same people, and they're in the European governments as well. A lot of people don't know it though, but it's the same people, and they absolutely are Satanists, and that's why they want to destroy, because it's Christ is their enemy, So, do you think that Agenda 2030 is anything like the protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion? Is there any similarities with that, which was done in 1897?
Yeah, my view of the protocols of the Elders of Zion is that this was a very sophisticated forgery. Certainly there were ideas in there that evildoers cling to, but I think there's a very deliberate agenda to hide behind the cover of Judaism and do some very bad things. And I think the Rothschilds are really Exhibit A. Even in the book of Revelation, Jesus warns about the synagogue of Satan, those who say they are Jews but are not actually Jews, right? And so what defines being a Jew? Well, what defines being a Jew, there's the genetic component, the ethnic component, but more importantly, the laws of Moses, the revelations of the creator of the heavens and the earth to a particular people group, the descendants of Abraham, who were meant to be a light unto the nations and bring the wisdom of God and the light of God's law to people everywhere. Well, what are the basics of God's law? Don't murder, don't steal, don't lie. These are basic principles of morality. And so when we have certain people claiming to be Jews, George Soros and Rothschilds are two that come to mind, and then embracing simultaneously things that are completely antithetical to everything that it actually means to be a Jew, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Israel, if you will, the people of Israel, obviously we have a major problem here. And so there are people who hide behind various guises. There are people who say they are Catholic, who, of course, embrace the satanic agenda. There are people who say they are Methodist, who embrace the satanic agenda. And what I would argue is that once you embrace the satanic agenda, you are none of those things, right? You are a Satanist. You are a destroyer of civilization. And we have to deal with that, and we have to recognize that. And I think there are people who would like to hide behind the Jews and say, oh, if you point out what I'm doing, then you hate Jews. No, actually, we love Jews. Right? If I read Romans 11, God's got a very special plan for the Jewish people. Many of them have come to know Jesus Christ. In fact, the Apostle Paul is Exhibit A. He was a ruthless persecutor of Christians and then came to know the Lord and became the greatest evangelist of all time. So God's got a great and marvelous purpose for the Jews. He has not abandoned them, as some of our Christian brothers and sisters would have us believe. But we also have people who try to use them as scapegoats, and also people who try to hide among them for nefarious purposes. And frankly, I think that needs to be called out. It's very dangerous. And, I don't think that we can say George Soros is a Jew in any real sense of the term. This is a guy who says he is an atheist, publicly. This is a guy who says he feels like God publicly. I mean, that's maybe the worst form of idolatry, right? You're not just making an idol, you are worshiping yourself. It sounds very much like what Lucifer got in trouble for. So, these are all issues that need to be dealt with. And to go back to the scripture for a moment, I think to have a true and proper understanding of what's going on, we always have to go back to the scripture. That needs to be our foundational starting point, our foundational truth against which everything else is measured. And for the people who are trying to understand this without the biblical lens to interpret it, I think they're inevitably going to make serious mistakes in their analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't blame somebody just because of the way they're born and put them all in the same bracket. Absolutely agree with you there. That's definitely not fair at all. And I, to add to that, the Freemasons as well, especially the ones that are right at the top, are part of this as well. And many of those are not Jewish.
Well, our own president actually had something. Our first president in this country had something interesting to say about that. There's a very good book that I highly encourage people to read. It was written by a Scottish Freemason called John Robison. It's called Proofs of a Conspiracy. And to be clear, this guy was a Mason, right? He was a proud Mason. And he went through the continent of Europe, traveling through the Masonic lodges. He was in Paris. He was in Berlin. He went up to St. Petersburg. And he said, wow, there is a secret society infiltrating the secret society that is planning to hijack it and use it for evil purposes. To be clear, he was very alarmed by this. He was trying to sound the alarm about this. And he was talking, of course, about an organization that came to be known as the Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt in 1776 in Bavaria. And he wrote a book about his findings. Like I said, it was called Proofs of a Conspiracy. And what he said was their objective was to overthrow all of the governments and religious institutions of Europe and ultimately to build a one-world system based on basically a totalitarian model of many of the same principles that Karl Marx would articulate about a century later. And he said they're infiltrating the Masonic lodges of Europe. He actually said their first great success was the French Revolution. He said they were the ones, this secret society within a secret society, that was responsible for plunging France into an unbelievable orgy of antichrist satanic violence and mass beheadings and blood running through the streets. They put a prostitute in Notre Dame and say, "Here's your goddess of reason." And so our first president was given a copy of this book by a minister friend of his, and he read it. And until recently, you could find it on the National Archives website. He wrote a letter back to his friend, and he says, hey, it was not my intention to doubt that these Illuminati, these Jacobins, have been infiltrating the United States of America. In fact, he says, no one is more convinced of that than I am. So what happened several hundred years ago with the Freemasonic lodges of Europe is they were infiltrated by a satanic conspiracy. To go back to what we were saying about the UN, it takes the principles that God has revealed and flips them upside down. Right? We're going to abolish family. We're going to abolish property. We're going to abolish nations and build a one-world totalitarian system. I believe that same idea, whether there's a direct connection going all the way back that far and maybe even earlier, I don't know. It's very difficult to track secret societies. But certainly the ideas, the satanic ideas, that thread runs continuously all the way back to the Illuminati and even before, all the way to the present-day destroyers of civilization.
Yeah, and let's remember that when Klaus Schwab says you will own nothing and be happy, is talking about us. He's not talking about these people at the top. They're going to be in these palatial palaces. So it's worse than communism what's coming, right? So how should we educate children about, in the school system? Because that's been taken over as well.
Oh, and this is kind of my passion. I've written 3 books on education now, including my most recent one. Just actually hasn't even come out yet, but I've got a few copies. It's called Woke and Weaponized: How Karl Marx Won the Battle for American Education and How We Can Win It Back. So this is what I believe is the most important thing that we need to deal with. I would say that the government school system was literally built by people who had this in mind. Going back to the earliest guys, even before Karl Marx, the earliest guys who seriously proposed that the government ought to be educating our children. Robert Owen claimed to be fighting the great trinity of evil. The trinity of evil, he said, was marriage, right? Private property, and irrational systems of religion, in particular Christianity. Set up a communist commune in Indiana. It's an incredible story. Later in life, shortly before he died, he admitted he was getting his ideas from talking to spirits with his little Ouija board. A true story, by the way. They built this system for the purpose of destroying civilization and undermining Christianity. And that's not my opinion, by the way. Robert Owen, who I just mentioned, he actually started a secret society modeled on the Carbonari in Italy, a nasty group of people. And a defector who later became a Roman Catholic, Orestes Brownson, wrote a book about what they were doing. He said the reason they were working to have government take over education was not so your kids could get a good education. He said the great object was to get rid of Christianity, right? The main reason they wanted the government educating your kids was so that they could undermine Christianity, undermine the church, undermine the faith. That was always the objective. Even back when they still had the Bible, they still did prayer, they couldn't openly propose getting rid of that just yet. But that was always their objective. And if we don't deal with the indoctrination of children, absent some sort of miracle or divine intervention, there's no hope of stopping this. There's absolutely no hope of stopping it. And you see, the UN acknowledges how important this is. In Agenda 21, in Chapter 36, they say education is, in their words, indispensable, is the word they use, to changing people's attitudes. They say it has to focus on spirituality. It needs to be integrated into all classes, all subjects. In the 2030 Agenda, goal number 4 deals exclusively with education, and it says every single learner, right? Every single one. There's no exception for homeschoolers in Oklahoma or South Carolina, whatever. Every single learner needs to be so brainwashed with this filthy nonsense that they will not just passively accept these ideas. It says they will promote sustainable development. Promote is the word that they use. And it says they have to believe in gender equality, global citizenship, sustainable development, human rights, the whole UN agenda, which sounds nice on the surface until you dig down. So we must get control of this. I would urge parents in the strongest possible terms, pull your children out of the government indoctrination camps right now. If you have to call the school district and tell them, call them right this moment. When you're done listening to this interview, look up their number, call and say, hey, my son, my daughter, my children are not coming back. We will be homeschooling them. We will be finding a good Christian school for them. We will not be sending them back to this indoctrination camp. I often use the analogy of like a burning building, because a lot of people say, oh, well, maybe we'll run for school board and, we would fix the system. And folks, if your children are in a burning building, and you hear them screaming and you smell the flesh burning, what parent would say, like, yeah, let's run for school board? No, you run in the building, you get your children out, and you run as fast as your legs will carry you, and you get them out. And you don't worry about, what am I going to do with them? How am I going to educate? What kind of curriculum? You just get them out, right? And then you think about the other stuff, and then you sound the alarm. And you wake up the rest of the town and say, hey, your children are also burning in that building. You might want to think about getting them out. And honestly, it's a quite inadequate metaphor, an analogy, because a burning building is only going to hurt your children physically. They are being utterly destroyed right now, physically, academically, morally, mentally, spiritually, in every possible way. They're being destroyed. So you have an obligation as a parent to get them out and get them a good education. My wife and I, we use a program called Classical Conversations. Actually, the CEO, Robert Bortons, is the co-author of this book with me. It's a wonderful program, biggest homeschool program in the world with about 140,000 students around the world. We love it. There's lots of other great tools out there, and there's lots of good Christian schools out there. But I don't think the system can be reformed. I don't think it can be redeemed. I think we just need to get our children out immediately and then pursue a real education, starting with what Proverbs 9:10, what Proverbs 1:7 say, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's the beginning of knowledge that has been completely lost in the government miseducation system. And unless we reclaim it, it's over, folks. It's just a matter of time.
So because you think this is a holy war?
Absolutely it is. It is a battle of good against evil. It is a battle of God against Satan. And God's already victorious, by the way. There's no question about how this is going to turn out. Satan was defeated at the cross by Jesus Christ. Praise the Lord. So the enemy is done, and he knows it. He knows his time is short. He knows he's going to the lake of fire. He wants to take as many suckers with him as possible. And, we who have been redeemed by Jesus Christ, we who have been reconciled and forgiven by the work of Jesus Christ on the cross, it's our job to let other people know, hey, the king's coming back. The evil's going to be utterly and completely annihilated. You need to lay down your weapons now, repent of your wickedness, and trust in Christ, because there is no hope for you otherwise. So I know how this battle ends. It is absolutely a battle of good versus evil. And I think to understand it in any other way really misses the point. Right? It's not just a battle against bad ideas, not just if we just prove the superiority of our arguments using logic and philosophy, they're all going to... No. We're dealing here with evil. And until people understand that, none of this other stuff makes sense, right? Why do they kill babies, right? Why are they so obsessed with murdering babies? Why are they desecrating family? Why are they destroying our society? It's because they are working for their father, the Bible says, and their father is Satan, right? I mean, that Jesus himself talked about this. The Apostle Paul talks about Satan as the god of this world. John talks about Satan as the ruler of the world. 1 John says the whole world is in the power of the evil one. And that's true. Right now, Satan has a lot of authority. He has blinded the minds of them which believe not the glorious gospel. But the reality is Satan is done for. He's cooked. It's over. He lost. And now it's a mop-up operation. God's given us our instructions, the Great Commission. We are to make disciples of all nations. We are to baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. We are to teach them to obey all that God has commanded, and we are to do it with love and humility. So we've got a big task before us, but I always tell people the Great Commission begins in your own home, with your own children. Then we can worry about discipling the nations.
And what about those people, perhaps the mother and the father or whoever's looking after the children? Maybe they work and they can't afford to homeschool. What advice would you give to those people?
Well, I've got a lot of thoughts on that. I would say, first of all, re-examine your priorities, because I hear we can't afford, and I say, well, wait, I afford it, and I was making almost no money when we got back to the United States, and I afford it. We drove one old car. We lived in a small house with 2 bedrooms. We had a lot of rice and beans. We didn't go out for dinner much. We didn't go on fancy vacations. But what's more important for you than your children, right? So first of all, look at your priorities, right? I hear some people say that, and then I see them go out in the parking lot, and they get into their 2024 BMW, and they're driving to their 4,000 square foot home, getting ready for their ski vacation or their Disney. Okay, where are your priorities? Second of all, when you have mom and dad working, a lot of people don't realize this, you're doing it for basically nothing. Right? When you factor in childcare costs and the increased tax burden and the increased commute, and you got to have the second car and you got to have the insurance, by the time you factor all that in, you're basically adding nothing by bringing in that second income. So, there are certain governments that do their best to make it impossible to have one parent stay home. Sweden actually publicly said one of the reasons they designed their tax code the way they did was so that mom could not stay home with the children. But generally speaking, it's an issue of priorities. For those who genuinely need help, there's lots of places where they can get help. I'm on the board of the Freedom Project Academy. We have a scholarship fund for students who are low income. Classical Conversations has a scholarship fund. The Homeschool Legal Defense Association has a scholarship fund. Virtually every Christian school will have a scholarship fund. Your church should be helping Christian families get out of the system. And a lot of it is just, priorities. Do you value the well-being and the education of your children enough to make some difficult choices and some sacrifices? And I hope people will be in prayer about it, because there's nothing more important. And I'll add this. When people tell me they can't afford it, I'll say you can't afford not to do it. You have no idea what's going to be happening to your children if you continue subjecting them to this. And I can't tell you, I did a speaking tour around the United States and around the world on this. Thousands of parents, no exaggeration, came up to me crying after my talks, and just, why didn't I know this before? Now my son won't talk to me. My daughter's a transgender. They hate me because I voted for Trump. They think they've lost their children. Their families have been destroyed. Their kids are drug addicts. You can't afford not to take your children out of the system.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because even those names you mentioned, they're all globalists. They're all part of this. Even Disney, it's got the 666 in the logo if you look closely. You're buying these fancy cars. Again, it's making sort of the enemy much richer to destroy us. So I think that's really good advice there. And just to touch on before we end, obviously the people in England and those nations we discussed earlier are really worried about Sharia law, worried about a war. Nobody wants to take that. We know it's a trap, though. We know it's a trap. What is your advice to the people of the UK and Europe right now that it's been flooded and they are worried about that? What should they actually do?
Well, there's a lot that could be said. I would start by saying you need to be evangelizing the people who have providentially been brought to your country, right? It's hard for us to send missionaries into Iraq and Syria and Libya and Afghanistan, but hey, they came to us, right? So now they're going to hear the gospel, and then when they go home, they can share the gospel with their fellow Afghans or Syrians or Libyans or whatever. So God has given us an incredible opportunity here to reach these people with the gospel in a way we could not have reached them before, and it would be shameful and foolish of us not to take advantage of that. Second of all, when we do take back control of the government, which in the United States, I think is starting to happen. Whether that's sustainable, we'll see. I hope that our cousins in the UK will see something similar. I think we need to be very serious about sending people back to where they came from. And that's a controversial subject and it's a taboo subject, but they need to go home. Very simply, they need to go home. Certain people, if they're well established and they've, become British or they've become American and they've gone through the process legally, they didn't commit fraud on their application, they didn't come across the border illegally, we can have a discussion. But when we're talking about people who are here illegally, when we're talking about people who committed fraud to get here, when we're talking about people who were imported by communists who hate our society and want to enslave us, they need to go home. And it's got to be done humanely. It's got to be done legally, but it must be done. There is no substitute for that. And it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a drawn-out process. But the alternative is the loss of the greatest civilizations that have existed in the history of mankind, and that's intolerable. The loss of our liberties and everything else. So I would say, take this opportunity to evangelize the people who have been brought into our countries so that when they are sent home, hopefully they will go home and they can make their own countries great. They can take the gospel of Jesus Christ. They can take the light of the Word of God, which is really what made the West, what made Christendom into the great place that it was. They can take that back to their own countries and they can say, hey guys, we could be like those countries. We just have to stop with all the foolishness. We have to stop worshiping our false deities, who Paul refers to as demons, and we have to worship the God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, the only true God of the universe, who was incarnate and came into this world as Jesus Christ. So that would be my recommendation for people. And, I don't hate the people who've come to our country, and I think it's a trap that the evildoers have laid for us. We should not hate these people. What would we do if our country was destroyed and some other government said, hey, why don't you come here for free and we'll give you free stuff? I mean, of course, any of us would go, right? And yeah, they came here with their false religion. They came here thinking they're going to do jihad and they're going to conquer the nation for Allah and whatever. So, okay, you know what? Who can blame them? Any other person would have done that if they were in the situation. So I don't hate these people. I feel sympathy for them. I feel compassion for them. But ultimately, they're going to have to go home for the most part. And we've got to do it lovingly and humanely. And hopefully they will take back some valuable lessons that they learned in the UK, that they learned in Sweden, that they learned in the United States. And they can make their countries great too, so that they don't have to clamor to get into our countries.
Yeah. Hear, hear. So, where can people... Well, actually, before we go, what's the one thing that you wish everybody was talking about right now that they're not talking enough about?
The sexualization, indoctrination, and the dumbing down of our children. There is no issue more important. Over the long term, there's no issue that's more important. We've got the immediate concerns, but we have to address this. It is the critical thing, and it will make all the difference in the world to your family, to your children, to your community, to your church, ultimately to your country and to your civilization. So, we talked about it a little bit. I can't emphasize strongly enough the importance of that. Everybody thinks of education as just one of many issues. It's not. It's the issue that transcends all the other issues. The reason why we've had our societies collapsing around us, the reason why the borders have been open, the socialism is expanding, the freedom is diminishing, is because they have brainwashed multiple generations of young people. There's no shortcut to fixing this. It has to begin there.
I'm a bit confused about why people are saying that some men are actually women and they were made the opposite sex when they were in the belly still. Do you understand what I'm talking about, to be able to explain that better?
Yeah, it's the indoctrination, and it's, Romans 1 talks a little bit about this too, the letter that Paul wrote to the Romans. The very first chapter talks about those who suppress the truth in their unrighteousness, and then God hands them over to a reprobate, to a depraved mind, and you see all around us exactly what we would expect to see when we read Romans 1. Our society, on a societal level, thanks to the government schools, has been suppressing the truth. That God made plain, by the way. He says he made his attributes plain, even just in the creation. You don't need to read your Bible to know that you were created by an all-powerful, all-knowing, loving God. Every baby in the world understands this, and they've done studies on this. It doesn't matter where you're born. Every baby in the world understands this. We have suppressed the truth in our unrighteousness, and we're now reaping the whirlwind as a result.
Yeah. Where can people find you on social media?
So people can go to my website, libertysentinel.org. We have a free newsletter. People can become paid subscribers if they'd like, but just go to libertysentinel.org. Sentinel is Sentinel. I'm also senior editor at The New American. You can find us at thenewamerican.com. I would encourage people to sign up for the free daily headlines. We put out breaking, critically important news stories there, thenewamerican.com. Classicalconversations.com is where you can find more about CC. And then on social media, I'm at AlexNewman_JOU. JOU standing for journalism. Liberty Sent is our Liberty Sentinel account. I got kicked off of Facebook for violating their terms of service, whatever that means. But those are the easiest places.
So you're on YouTube and Instagram, is that right?
And Rumble. Rumble's where we put most of our videos. So rumble.com, Liberty Sentinel is our channel. We do have a YouTube, but we haven't used it much because we keep getting kicked off and strikes and whatever. But yeah, X is where we're doing a lot. AlexNewman_JOU.
I'll put the links to those in the comment in the description below, guys. And what about books that you mentioned earlier? Or is there any books that you think people should be reading?
So my latest one, it's not even out on Amazon yet. It's called Woke and Weaponized. If you live in the United States, you can order it directly from my website, libertysentinel.org. It'll be on Amazon soon. If you live in the UK, my last book on education is called Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, Government Schools' War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It. It's been endorsed by Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, General Michael Flynn, National Security Advisor. They're saying this is the book you have to read if you want to save our country. And that is available even on UK Amazon. So you can get that there. Deep State, the Invisible Government Behind the Scenes. Very important. I'm releasing a second edition soon. But that's also available on Amazon or my website or any place good books are sold.
Great. Thanks a lot, Alex.
Thank you, Kerry.
Here's another video for you coming up here where it's showing you exactly what is going on that you should watch now.